Picture this, a Messerschmitt Bf-109, the Luftwaffe's apex predator, sitting intact on Soviet soil. The year is 1942, and what happens next will rewrite the entire doctrine of aerial warfare on the Eastern Front. But before we dive into this incredible story, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. Are there any aviation enthusiasts out there, or history buffs who love untold stories of World War II? Now, you might think you know everything about the air war over Russia. You've heard about the brutal dogfights, the frozen cockpits, the seemingly endless German victories in the early years. But what you're about to discover is a story that military historians whisper about in hushed tones. A story of captured technology, shattered pride, and a revolutionary transformation that would turn Soviet pilots from prey into predators. This isn't just another war story. This is the moment when desperation met brilliance, when humiliation sparked innovation, and when a single enemy aircraft became the key to unlocking victory itself. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 wasn't just a fighter plane. It was a statement of German engineering superiority, a flying manifestation of the Reich's belief in its own invincibility. By 1942, this lethal machine had dominated the skies over Poland, France, Britain, and now Russia. Its reputation preceded it like thunder before lightning. Soviet pilots would see that distinctive silhouette diving from the sun and their hearts would sink. The Bf-109 was faster, climbed better, turned tighter, and seemed to anticipate every move its opponents made. It wasn't just a technological advantage, it was a psychological weapon that whispered the same message with every kill. You are inferior. You will lose. Resistance is futile. But on a cold morning near Smolensk, everything changed. A German pilot, his aircraft damaged by ground fire during a strafing run, made an emergency landing in a snow-covered field behind Soviet lines. Perhaps his engine had seized, perhaps his fuel line had been punctured. The exact details remain contested by historians. What matters is this: for the first time, Soviet aviation engineers would get their hands on an intact, flyable Bf-109G, the latest variant, with all its secrets exposed. The pilot was captured before he could destroy the aircraft. Soviet infantry surrounded the plane, their weapons trained on the downed airman, preventing him from completing the standard protocol of setting his fighter ablaze. Within hours, the aircraft was being towed under camouflage netting toward a secure airfield. Within days, it was in the hands of the Soviet aviation industry's most brilliant minds. Now, you have to understand the context here. The Soviet Air Force in 1942 was fighting with one hand tied behind its back. Their primary fighters, the Yak-1, the Yak-3, the MiG-3, were courageous attempts at modern aircraft design, but they were fundamentally outclassed. Soviet pilots weren't inferior. Soviet courage wasn't lacking, but their tools were inadequate and they knew it. Every mission was a calculated risk. Every dogfight was survival against superior odds. The doctrine had become simple, almost brutally so. Get close, use overwhelming firepower, and hope your heavier armament could compensate for inferior flight characteristics. Soviet fighters were being built like flying gun platforms, heavy with cannons and machine guns, armored to survive punishment, but consequently slower and less maneuverable than their German adversaries. The captured Bf-109 arrived at the Central Aerohydrodynamic Institute, known by its Russian acronym TSAGI, where it would undergo the most thorough examination any enemy aircraft had ever received on Soviet soil. The chief test pilot assigned to evaluate the captured fighter was a man named Arseny Vorozhkin, a veteran with over 300 combat missions, a survivor who had seen too many friends die in unequal aerial combat. Vorozhkin was accompanied by a team of Soviet aviation designers, including engineers from the Yakovlev Design Bureau, all of them hungry for answers to a single burning question: why does this aircraft win? The initial ground inspection revealed meticulous German engineering. Every panel fit precisely. Every control surface moved with smooth mechanical efficiency. The cockpit layout was logical, intuitive, designed for split-second decision-making in combat. The engine, a Daimler-Benz DB605, was a masterpiece of power-to-weight optimization, but these were surface observations. The real secrets would only reveal themselves in flight. When Vorozhkin first climbed into the cockpit of the Bf-109, strapping himself into enemy leather, gripping enemy controls, he felt a strange mixture of anticipation and dread. This was the machine that had killed so many of his comrades. Now he would understand it from within. The engine roared to life with a distinctive snarl, different from the sound of Soviet aircraft engines, more refined, more controlled. He taxied to the runway, ran through the pre-flight checks, and pushed the throttle forward. The acceleration was immediate and authoritative. The aircraft wanted to fly. Within seconds, the wheels left Soviet Earth, and Vorozhkin found himself climbing at a rate that made his stomach tighten. This wasn't just faster than his Yak-1. This was a different category of performance entirely. As he put the Bf-109 through a series of test maneuvers, climbs, dives, turns, rolls, a cold realization settled over him like winter fog. Every movement was precise. Every control input produced an immediate, predictable response. There was no sloppiness, no lag, no fighting against the aircraft's tendencies. The Bf-109 wasn't just fast. It was harmonious. It was an extension of the pilot's intention. When he pulled into a climbing turn, the aircraft maintained energy that Soviet fighters would have bled away in seconds. When he rolled inverted and pulled through, the nose tracked cleanly without wallowing or sliding. This was what German pilots experienced every single day. This was why they could dictate the terms of engagement, choosing when to fight and when to disengage. This was why Soviet fighters fell from the sky in such terrible numbers. The silence in the debriefing room after Vorozhekin's first flight was deafening. The test pilot sat at a worn wooden table, surrounded by designers, engineers, and military officials, all waiting for his assessment. The tension was palpable. Some of these men had built the fighters Vorozhekin was implicitly criticizing. Others had sent pilots to die in those inadequate machines. National pride hung in the balance. The Soviet aviation industry's entire philosophical approach to fighter design was about to be questioned. Vorozhekin chose his words carefully, but he didn't soften the truth. "Comrades," he began, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of revelation, "we have been building our fighters incorrectly. We have been fighting this war with the wrong assumptions." The room erupted in defensive objections. How dare he suggest Soviet engineering was inferior? Had he forgotten that Soviet pilots were winning battles every day through sheer determination and bravery? Wasn't he insulting the memory of fallen comrades by praising fascist technology? But Vorozhekin raised his hand, silencing the outrage. "I praise nothing," he said quietly. "I report facts. This aircraft achieves superiority not through heavy armament, but through the ability to control the engagement, speed, climb rate, energy retention. These are the true weapons of air combat. Our pilots are brave beyond measure, but we are asking them to fight with one arm tied behind their backs." The crowd in that room represented different factions of Soviet aviation philosophy. There were the old guard designers who believed in the armored, heavily armed fighter as a flying fortress. There were pragmatists who knew resources were limited, and complex designs were luxuries the Soviet Union couldn't afford. There were military commanders who measured success in enemy kills, not elegant engineering solutions. And there were a few younger designers, including representatives from Alexander Yakovlev's bureau, who listened with intense focus, their minds already racing toward implications and possibilities. Over the following weeks, the captured Bf-109 was flown, repeatedly by different Soviet test pilots. Each one returned with similar observations. The German fighter's greatest advantage wasn't any single characteristic. It was the integration of all characteristics into a coherent whole. Lightweight, powerful engine, clean aerodynamics, efficient control surfaces. These elements worked together to create an aircraft that could choose its battles, strike from advantage, and escape before the enemy could respond. It was the aerial equivalent of a rapier versus a club. Soviet fighters had been designed as clubs, heavy, blunt instruments meant to bludgeon opponents at close range. The Bf-109 was a rapier, precise, fast, deadly through speed and positioning rather than raw hitting power. The implications were staggering and humbling. The entire Soviet fighter doctrine, forged in the desperate early days of the war, when stopping German bombers was the priority, was being revealed as obsolete. The emphasis on heavy forward-firing armament, the acceptance of weight penalties for armor protection, the willingness to sacrifice climb rate and speed for firepower, all of these design choices were being exposed as fundamentally flawed in fighter versus fighter combat. The Bf-109 didn't need massive firepower because it could position itself for perfect deflection shots. It didn't need heavy armor because it could avoid being hit in the first place. It won through maneuverability and energy, not through slugging matches. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn, where humiliation transforms into determination, where the protagonist emerges not from pride, but from the willingness to learn from enemies. Alexander Sergeyevich Yakovlev, the chief designer of the Yakovlev Design Bureau, was a man of unusual humility for someone of his position and influence. He had risen through the Soviet aviation industry not through political connections or self-promotion, but through a genuine talent for understanding what pilots needed. He listened. He adapted. He wasn't emotionally attached to his previous designs in a way that blinded him to their shortcomings. When the reports from the captured Bf-109 evaluation began circulating through the upper echelons of Soviet aviation, many designers became defensive, making excuses, blaming production quality or pilot training. Yakovlev did something different. He went to the airfield himself and asked to fly the German fighter. At 50 years old, Yakovlev was no longer a young man, and he wasn't a test pilot by training. He was a designer, an administrator, a man whose battles were fought with drafting pencils and wind tunnel data. But he understood that you cannot design fighters from behind a desk without understanding what flight actually feels like. He had flown many of his own designs in their prototype stages, feeling for problems that couldn't be measured by instruments. Now he needed to feel what the enemy had achieved. The test pilots were skeptical. Some thought it was grandstanding. Others worried about the safety risks of putting a valuable designer in a foreign aircraft with unfamiliar handling characteristics. But Yakovlev insisted, and his position gave him the authority to make such decisions. When Yakovlev climbed into the Bf-109's cockpit, he brought with him decades of aeronautical knowledge and an engineer's analytical mind. As the aircraft lifted off and he began working through basic maneuvers, something profound happened. This wasn't just data collection. This was revelation. He felt the harmony between power and weight, the responsiveness of controls that didn't fight the pilot, the way the aircraft seemed eager to do what he asked of it. Every design decision made by the Messerschmitt team suddenly made visceral sense in a way that blueprints and reports could never convey. This was what excellence felt like. This was the standard. After landing, Yakovlev walked directly to his car without speaking to anyone, his face unreadable, his mind clearly processing implications that went beyond simple aircraft design. He drove back to his design bureau in Moscow and immediately called a meeting of his entire engineering team. What he said in that room would become legendary in Soviet aviation circles, repeated in design bureaus and military academies for generations. "Comrades," Yakovlev began, his voice carrying the weight of unwelcome truth. "I have just flown the future, and we are living in the past. Everything we thought we knew about fighter design is incomplete. The Germans have not won through magic or superior genetics or fascist ideology. They have won through better understanding of the fundamental physics of air combat. And if they can understand it, so can we. If they can build it, we can build it better." The room was silent. These were his people, his team, designers and engineers who had worked themselves to exhaustion producing aircraft for the war effort. And here was their leader essentially telling them that their work had been based on flawed premises. Some felt defensive. Others felt defeated. But Yakovlev continued, and his next words transformed the narrative from criticism to challenge. "I am not blaming anyone in this room. The doctrine we followed was created in good faith based on the information we had. But now we have new information. Now we understand. And we have a choice. We can defend our egos and continue building inadequate fighters, sending pilots to die in machines we know are inferior. Or we can admit we were wrong, learn from our enemies, and build something that will turn this war around. I know which choice honors our pilots. I know which choice serves the motherland." The transformation of the Yakovlev Design Bureau's philosophy didn't happen overnight, but it happened with remarkable speed considering the conservative nature of military procurement and design. Yakovlev had influence, credibility, and most importantly, he had flown the Bf-109 himself and could speak from personal experience to skeptical military officials and Communist Party overseers. His pitch was simple and compelling. Strip away unnecessary weight, prioritize speed, and climb rate over heavy armament. Trust that maneuverability and pilot skill would matter more than armor and firepower. Build a fighter that could outturn and outclimb the Bf-109, even if it meant accepting lighter armament. Build a weapon for skilled pilots, not a flying tank for survivors. The pushback was intense and came from multiple directions. Military commanders argued that lighter armament meant fewer kills per engagement. Production managers worried about retooling factories. Party officials questioned whether Yakovlev was showing ideologically suspect admiration for fascist engineering. Conservative designers from competing bureaus saw an opportunity to discredit a rival by accusing him of chasing impossible fantasies, while the war demanded practical, proven designs. The criticism was relentless, public, and often personal. Yakovlev was called naive, reckless, a dreamer disconnected from battlefield realities. Some whispered that he was risking pilots' lives by prioritizing elegant engineering over proven firepower. But Yakovlev had an advantage that his critics didn't. He had the support of the pilots themselves. When word spread through fighter regiments that someone was finally listening to what they had been screaming about for years, that they needed speed and maneuverability more than they needed cannons, pilots began writing letters, filing reports, testifying before military committees. These weren't theoretical debates in design bureaus. These were men who dodged Bf-109s every day, who watched friends die because Soviet fighters couldn't climb fast enough or turn tight enough. When a respected pilot like Arseny Vorozhkin stood before a committee and said, "Give me Yakovlev's new fighter and I will show you victory," it carried weight that no design specification could match. The Yak-3 project moved forward under intense pressure and scrutiny. Every design decision was questioned. Every compromise was debated. The aircraft that emerged from this crucible was radically different from previous Soviet fighters. Smaller, lighter, cleaner, powered by the same engine as heavier aircraft, but carrying far less weight. It had only a single cannon and a single machine gun, barely half the armament of earlier Yaks. Conservative. Critics called it a toy, a racer masquerading as a fighter, a beautiful engineering exercise that would get pilots killed. The tension as the first prototype approached its maiden flight was absolutely palpable. Yakovlev's entire reputation, his bureau's future, perhaps even his personal safety in Stalin's Soviet Union, rested on whether this radical philosophy would actually work. Test pilot Pyotr Mikhailovich Stefanovsky, a hero of the Soviet Union and one of the most respected aviators in the Aviation country, was chosen for the Yak-3's first flights. Stefanovsky had flown everything the Soviet Union produced and had also extensively tested the captured Bf-109. He understood both what was being aimed for and what was at stake. When he climbed into the Yak-3 prototype for the first time, he carried with him the hopes of everyone who believed that Soviet engineering could learn, adapt, and overcome. The engine started cleanly. The taxi was smooth. And then, as Stefanovsky pushed the throttle forward and the Yak-3 leaped into the air, something remarkable became immediately apparent. This wasn't just comparable to the Bf-109. In some ways, this was better. The climb rate was astonishing. The control harmony was beautiful. The roll rate was exceptional. Most importantly, the aircraft felt alive, responsive, eager. All the qualities that made the Bf-109 so deadly, but refined through Soviet understanding of what pilots actually needed in Eastern Front combat conditions. When Stefanovsky landed after that first flight, he didn't walk to the debriefing room. He ran. He burst through the doors where Yakovlev and his team waited in nervous anticipation, and his first words were, "It flies like it's been waiting its whole life to fly. This will change everything." The crowd of engineers, designers, military observers, and party officials erupted in cheers. But Yakovlev remained quietly seated, his eyes closed, his shoulders finally relaxing after months of crushing pressure. He had bet everything on a philosophy derived from studying an enemy aircraft, on the humility to admit that Soviet designs had been inadequate, on the courage to completely reverse doctrine in the middle of a war. And it had worked. The Yak-3 wasn't just a good fighter. It was a revelation, a vindication, a redemption of Soviet aviation engineering through the willingness to learn rather than defend ego. But here's where the story takes its final, most profound turn. The Yak-3 entered service in 1944, and within weeks reports began flooding back from the front lines that seemed almost too good to believe. Soviet pilots were not just surviving encounters with Bf-109s, they were winning decisively. The lightweight Soviet fighter could outturn, outclimb, and out-accelerate the German aircraft that had terrorized the Eastern Front for years. Luftwaffe pilots, accustomed to commanding the skies through superior equipment, suddenly found themselves outmatched. German combat. Reports from this period show a fascinating shift in tone from confident superiority to confused frustration. How had the Soviets suddenly produced a fighter that could consistently defeat the Bf-109? The answer, which German intelligence eventually pieced together, was both simple and profoundly ironic. The Yak-3 was superior because it was designed by engineers who had studied the Bf-109 with humility and learned its lessons completely. Soviet designers hadn't tried to copy the German fighter. They had understood its principles and then applied those principles to create something uniquely suited to Soviet needs and capabilities. The student had surpassed the teacher not through theft, but through genuine understanding and innovation. The captured Bf-109 near Smolensk, the aircraft that was supposed to represent German invincibility, had become the catalyst for German defeat in the air. Soviet pilot Alexander Pokrishkin, who would become one of the highest-scoring aces of World War II, flew the Yak-3 extensively and later wrote about the psychological transformation it created. "For years," he wrote, "we fought with courage, but also with the knowledge that our aircraft were inferior. We overcame this through tactics, teamwork, and willingness to take risks that terrified the Germans. But the Yak-3 changed everything. Now we had an aircraft that was simply better. The fear left us. We became hunters instead of prey. That single change in our minds was worth 100 aircraft in its impact on the air war. The production numbers tell the story of redemption through humility. By the end of 1944, Yak-3s were rolling off Soviet production lines in substantial numbers. Pilot after pilot requested transfer to units equipped with the new fighter. German bomber formations, once protected by seemingly invincible Bf-109 escorts, began suffering catastrophic losses. The Luftwaffe, already stretched thin across multiple fronts, found itself unable to maintain air superiority over the Eastern Front. The skies that had belonged to Germany since 1941 now belonged to Soviet pilots flying an aircraft born from captured enemy technology and the wisdom to learn from it. But the most moving part of this story isn't the technical specifications or the combat statistics. It's the human transformation embodied in Alexander Yakovlev's journey from defensive nationalism to humble learning to innovative triumph. After the war, when Yakovlev was asked about the Yak-3s' genesis and the role the captured Bf-109 played in its development, he could have claimed it was all Soviet ingenuity, minimizing the German contribution. He could have protected his ego and nationalist pride. Instead, he told the truth. "The Messerschmitt taught us that we had been wrong," he said in a post-war interview. "That lesson was painful but necessary. Pride kills. Humility learns. I am not ashamed that we learned from our enemies. I am proud that we learned well." This attitude, this willingness to acknowledge that wisdom can come from unexpected and even hostile sources, stands in stark contrast to the rigid ideological thinking that characterized so much of Soviet society. In a system that often punished admission of error, that confused confidence with strength and flexibility with weakness, Yakovlev demonstrated that true strength comes from the courage to say, "I was wrong and I will do better." The lives saved by the Yak-3, the battles won, the eventual victory in North, the air war over the Eastern Front, all of these flowed from one man's decision to examine his assumptions and privilege truth over ego. The captured Bf-109 near Smolensk never flew again after its evaluation period. It sat in a hangar examined by generations of Soviet aviation students, a trophy certainly, but more importantly, a teacher. That single aircraft, built in Germany to dominate the skies through technical superiority, ended up giving the Soviet Union the knowledge needed to defeat that very superiority. It's a paradox that contains profound lessons extending far beyond aviation or World War II. Think about what this story really tells us. It tells us that your enemy can be your greatest teacher if you have the humility to learn rather than the pride that insists on defending flawed ideas. It tells us that wisdom isn't about being right initially. It's about being willing to become right through adaptation and growth. It tells us that the strongest position isn't defensive arrogance but open-minded flexibility. The German pilots who flew Bf-109s with such lethal effectiveness never imagined that their aircraft would become the blueprint for their own defeat. They saw their technological edge as proof of inherent superiority, rather than as a temporary advantage that could be studied, understood, and surpassed. Yakovlev and the Soviet aviation industry could have responded to the Bf-109's dominance with excuses, with blame, with defensive nationalism that insisted Soviet designs were already adequate and losses were due to other factors. Instead, they responded with questions. Why does this work? What can we learn? How can we improve? That shift from defensive to inquisitive, from closed to open, from proud to humble, made all the difference between continued defeat and ultimate victory. The lesson extends into every aspect of human endeavor. How often do we encounter ideas, techniques, or perspectives that challenge our established ways of thinking? How often do we respond defensively, protecting our ego and our investment in current approaches, rather than asking whether there might be wisdom worth learning even from unexpected or unwelcome sources? The captured Bf-109 was unwelcome. It represented enemy success and Soviet failure. Learning from it required admitting inadequacy. But that admission, that humility, that willingness to be taught by circumstances rather than dictate to them, ultimately saved countless lives and changed the course of history. If you've made it this far in the story, I want you to do something. Hit that like button if this story moved you or taught you something. Drop a comment sharing a time when you learned something valuable from an unexpected source, maybe even from a rival or opponent. And subscribe to this channel because we're dedicated to bringing you history's most profound lessons, the stories that don't just inform but transform how you see the world. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that admitting you were wrong isn't weakness. It's the beginning of wisdom. The Yak-3 flew until the end of the war and beyond, a testament to what happens when brilliance meets humility. Alexander Yakovlev went on to design many more successful aircraft, but he always said the Yak-3 was special because it taught him that the best designs come not from defending what you think you know, but from constantly questioning, constantly learning, constantly growing. UPA pilots who flew the Yak-3 into combat carried with them not just a superior aircraft, but a philosophy that yesterday's defeat can become today's wisdom if you're brave enough to learn from it. So the next time you're tempted to defend a failing approach because admitting error feels too painful, remember the captured Messerschmitt near Smolensk. Remember that the aircraft built to prove superiority ended up teaching its enemies how to win. Remember that the strongest response to challenge isn't defensive pride but curious humility. The skies over the Eastern Front were transformed not by Soviet pilots becoming braver, they were already impossibly brave, but by Soviet designers becoming wiser, willing to learn even from those they were fighting. That captured Bf-109 sits in a museum now, a relic of a war long past. But the lesson it taught remains eternally relevant. Wisdom doesn't care about nationality, ideology, or pride. Wisdom comes to those who ask questions and listen to answers, even when those answers are uncomfortable. The Yak-3 exists because Alexander Yakovlev had the courage to fly an enemy fighter and admit, "This is better, and we must learn why." That courage, that humility, that openness to transformation, that's what changed everything. But the story doesn't end with victory parades and museum displays. There's one final chapter that rarely gets told, a post-war moment that reveals the deepest truth of this entire narrative. It's 1956, 11 years after the war's end. Alexander Yakovlev, now a celebrated hero of socialist labor and one of the Soviet Union's most decorated designers, receives an unexpected invitation. A delegation of German aeronautical engineers, former Messerschmitt employees now working to rebuild their nation's aviation industry, requests a meeting in Moscow. The Cold War is in full swing. Tensions between East and West are extreme. Many Soviet officials advise Yakovlev to refuse. Why give potential enemies any access or information? But Yakovlev, remembering the lesson that changed everything, agrees to meet them. The meeting takes place in a conference room at the Central Aerohydrodynamic Institute, the same building where the captured Bf-109 was first evaluated 14 years earlier. The German engineers arrive nervous, uncertain of their reception. Among them is Klaus Heinemann, a former Messerschmitt test pilot who had flown Bf-109s over the Eastern Front and survived the war. Heinemann had heard rumors about a captured Bf-109 influencing Soviet fighter design, but never knew the full story. As Yakovlev enters the room, the atmosphere is thick with historical weight. Former enemies, separated by ideology and recent bloodshed, now face to face. Yakovlev does something that stuns everyone present. He personally escorts the German delegation to the hangar where the captured Bf-109 still sits, preserved as a historical artifact. He walks them around the aircraft, pointing out specific design elements, explaining in detail how each feature influenced the Yak-3's development. The German engineers stand in silence, processing the revelation that their wartime work, intended to destroy the Soviet Union, had instead educated it. The irony is almost overwhelming. Heinemann, the former Luftwaffe pilot, stares at the aircraft he once flew in combat, now a teacher to his former enemies. Then Yakovlev says something that transforms the moment from historical curiosity to profound wisdom. "Gentlemen," he begins, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won understanding. "This aircraft taught me the most important lesson of my career. It taught me that knowledge has no flag, no ideology, no nationality. Truth is truth, whether it comes from friend or enemy, whether it flatters our assumptions or destroys them. You built this aircraft to defeat us. Instead, it taught us how to defeat you. But that's not a source of shame for either of us. That's the nature of human progress. We build on what came before, we learn from those who challenge us, and wisdom emerges not from victory but from the willingness to acknowledge when someone else understood something better than we did." The tension in that hangar visibly shifts. One of the German engineers, his voice trembling slightly, asks the question that had been haunting him. "Do you hate us for what we built? For how many of your people died facing our aircraft?" The question hangs in the air, heavy with moral complexity. Everyone waits for Yakovlev's response. He takes a long moment before answering, choosing his words with the same precision he once used for aircraft design. "Hate?" Yakovlev repeats, considering the word. "No, I don't hate you. I hate war. I hate the ideologies that start wars. I hate the systems that force brilliant minds to create weapons instead of wonders. But you, as engineers, as designers, as people who understood aerodynamics and pursued excellence in your craft? No, I don't hate you. In fact, I'm grateful to you because your work, your excellence, forced us to become excellent ourselves. You pushed us to abandon comfortable mediocrity and achieve something we didn't know we were capable of. That's not something to hate, that's something to honor, even as we mourn the context that made it necessary. Klaus Heinemann, the former Luftwaffe pilot, steps forward. His eyes are wet. Herr Yakovlev, he says, his Russian heavily accented but earnest. I flew the Bf-109 over your country. I shot down Soviet aircraft. I killed your pilots, your countrymen, people fighting to defend their homes. I have lived with that burden for 11 years, wondering if those men had families, if they had children, if I robbed the world of good people for a cause that turned out to be evil. And now you tell me that the aircraft I flew, the machine I used to kill, became a tool for learning instead of just death. I don't know whether that makes it better or worse, but I know it means something. It has to mean something. Yakovlev walks over to Heinemann and, in a gesture that defies all Cold War protocol and Soviet security concerns, extends his hand. It means that human beings can learn and grow even through the worst circumstances. It means that wisdom can emerge from tragedy. It means that we are not bound by the past unless we choose to be. You were a pilot following orders in a war you didn't start. I was a designer trying to protect my people. We were both trapped in history's machinery. But now we can choose differently. Now we can be teachers instead of killers, builders instead of destroyers. The Bf-109 taught me how to make better aircraft. Let that be its legacy instead of just the death it caused. The two men shake hands, and something profound occurs in that moment. A German pilot who killed Soviet aviators, and a Soviet designer who created the fighter that shot down German pilots, find common ground in the universal human capacity for growth, forgiveness, and transformation. The other engineers approach, and soon the entire group is examining the captured Bf-109 together, not as enemies or even former enemies, but as fellow students of aeronautical science, discussing design philosophy, sharing post-war discoveries, learning from each other the way Yakovlev learned from their wartime creation. As the meeting concludes and the German delegation prepares to leave, Heinemann turns back one final time. Thank you, he says simply. Thank you for showing me that the worst chapters of our lives can still teach wisdom to others. Thank you for proving that learning is stronger than hatred. I will carry this lesson for the rest of my days. Yakovlev nods, understanding that some lessons are so profound they echo across decades, across borders, across the deepest human divisions. That meeting in 1956 never made it into official histories. It was too nuanced for Cold War propaganda, too humanistic for rigid ideological narratives. But the engineers who were present told the story quietly, in design bureaus and universities, to students and colleagues. The lesson spread not through official channels, but through human connection. Excellence recognizes excellence, wisdom honors wisdom, and the capacity to learn from anyone, even former enemies, is the mark of true strength. Today, the captured Bf-109 still exists in a Russian aviation museum, its German markings faded, its engine silent. Next to it, perfectly preserved, sits a Yak-3, the fighter born from humility and transformed into legend. The placard between them tells the technical story, specifications, combat records, historical context, but it doesn't tell the deeper truth, that these two aircraft, built by nations at war, ended up teaching the same lesson about human potential. We live in a world still divided by ideology, nationality, politics, and pride. We still encounter ideas that challenge our assumptions and people whose success makes us question our own approaches. And we still face the same choice Yakovlev faced in 1942. Defend our ego and our established methods, or embrace the humility to learn from anyone who has something to teach, regardless of where that wisdom originates. The captured Messerschmitt near Smolensk is still teaching us, still challenging us to ask, what are we defending out of genuine conviction, and what are we defending out of pride? What could we learn if we approached our rivals, our competitors, even our enemies, as potential teachers rather than threats to be dismissed? Alexander Yakovlev died in 1989, just as the Soviet Union he served was beginning its final collapse. In his last interview, given from a hospital bed, he was asked what he was most proud of in his long career. He didn't mention the dozens of aircraft he designed, the awards he received, or the battles his fighters won. Instead, he said this: "I'm most proud of the day I climbed into an enemy aircraft and admitted I had been wrong. Everything good that came after flowed from that moment of honest humility. I hope the next generation of designers in Russia or anywhere else learns that lesson without needing a war to teach it. So here's the final truth this story offers you. The Yak-3 exists not because Soviet engineers were brilliant, though they were. It exists not because Russian pilots were brave, though they were impossibly brave. It exists because one man had the wisdom to look at his enemy's success and ask, "What can this teach me?" instead of, "How can I discredit this?" That question, that openness, that humility in the face of uncomfortable truth is available to every single one of us in every aspect of our lives. The next time you encounter someone doing something better than you, someone whose success challenges your methods or threatens your status, you face the same choice Yakovlev faced. You can defend your current approach, make excuses, find reasons why their success doesn't count or doesn't apply to your situation. Or you can ask the question that changes everything. What can this teach me? How can this make me better? That question is the beginning of transformation. That question is how students become masters. That question is how the captured becomes the teacher, how defeat becomes victory, how humility becomes strength. If this story reached something deep inside you, if it changed how you think about learning, growth, or the sources of wisdom, then do this. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we're dedicated to finding these profound lessons hidden in history's most fascinating moments. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that asking for help isn't weakness, that admitting error isn't failure, that learning from anyone and everyone is the true mark of genius. Drop a comment telling us about a time when humility opened doors that pride had closed. Let's build a community of people who understand that the strongest position is not defensive arrogance but curious openness. The captured Bf-109 near Smolensk changed the course of World War II in the skies over Russia. But more importantly, it demonstrated a principle that transcends any single conflict or any historical moment. Wisdom comes to those who seek it with open minds and humble hearts, regardless of where it originates. That lesson is as relevant today as it was in 1942. That lesson is eternal.